Picture a room with no windows, 17 screens. The kind of room where the people inside it have not been surprised in 30 years. And then one morning, at precisely the moment they believed the world was still theirs to arrange, a single headline appeared. 6 words, and nobody moved. Not because it announced a war, not because it named a weapon, because it named a city. And the city was not Washington. That is the story nobody's telling you correctly. The media will give you the surface version, a diplomatic spat, a trade dispute, 2 leaders who do not like each other. What they will not tell you is that by the time that headline appeared, the decision had already been made. The documents were already signed. The architecture was already standing. The window for intervention had closed months earlier, quietly, while the most powerful government on earth was looking somewhere else. What happened was not a confrontation. It was a substitution. And the man who engineered it never once raised his voice. Here is the number that puts everything in context. For 78 years, 100% of NATO's core financial decision-making ran through a single capital. Every major procurement, every emergency coordination mechanism, every strategic lending framework that shaped how Western democracies built and maintained their defenses. One city, one approval chain, one indispensable center. 78 years. That is not a policy arrangement. That is a civilizational habit. And civilizational habits, when they break, do not break with a declaration. They break with a headquarters announcement and a press conference that was already scheduled before anyone thought to object. What that number means concretely is this. The alliance had been so architecturally dependent on Washington for so long that the idea of a parallel financial system was not just politically uncomfortable. It was cognitively unavailable. Nobody imagined it because nobody needed to, until they did. And the reason they needed to, that is the part the official narrative prefers to skip. To understand the mechanism, you have to understand what was actually being built. Not a military alliance, not a new treaty, a bank. Specifically, a defense innovation bank designed to finance the next generation of warfare, artificial intelligence, quantum systems, cyber infrastructure, drone technology, biomedical security networks, without requiring the blessing of any single national capital. On paper, it looked like every other multilateral institution. Governance committees, contribution schedules, lending frameworks. The kind of document that makes television anchors visibly lose the will to live. But beneath the bureaucratic language was something genuinely revolutionary, a parallel financial architecture for Western security, one that operated independently of Wall Street, independently of Pentagon procurement channels, and most critically, independently of Washington's political cycle. The institution needed a host. The criteria, when you laid them out plainly, pointed in an unexpected direction. Political stability, banking credibility, no imperial history that would alarm smaller member states, no recent record of weaponizing alliances for domestic advantage, strong relationships across both European and Indo-Pacific democratic governments. The United States did not meet the criteria. Canada did. That verdict, delivered not in anger, not in confrontation, but in the cold language of institutional risk assessment, was the most devastating thing that had happened to American alliance leadership in a generation. Not because it was hostile, because it was clinical. The man at the center of this had not arrived in politics through politics. He had arrived through the architecture of money itself. A PhD from Oxford, 13 years at Goldman Sachs, governor of the Bank of Canada during the years when other economies were fracturing and Canada's held. Then governor of the Bank of England, the first and only non-British citizen ever appointed to that role. Then chairman of the Financial Stability Board, one of the principal designers of the post-crisis global financial regulatory framework. When this man spoke about economic sovereignty, he was not speaking in the rhetorical shorthand of campaign season. He was speaking the way an engineer describes a load-bearing wall, with sequencing, with specificity, with the quiet, absolute confidence of someone who has already run the structural calculations. To European finance ministers who had spent years navigating Washington's mood swings, he sounded like something they had almost forgotten was possible. A partner whose positions did not change depending on who was watching. A partner whose stability was not conditional on the next electoral cycle. To Washington, he sounded like something else. Not an adversary you could confront or out-negotiate. A slowly rising tide. Quiet, inevitable, impossible to intimidate into retreat. The retaliation, when it came, revealed more than it concealed. Washington froze participation in a military coordination body between the United States and Canada that had existed since 1940. Since the era when both nations stood together against genuine existential threats to Western civilization, 85 years of institutional continuity suspended as a punishment. The stated reason was Canada's supposed failure on defense commitments. There was one problem. Canada had already exceeded NATO's defense spending benchmarks. Under the current government, Canadian military investment had increased substantially and crossed every threshold Washington had spent years demanding. The justification collapsed on contact with the facts, and European governments noticed immediately. The message the retaliation actually sent was this: build financial independence, and we will freeze military cooperation. Reduce your dependence on Washington, and Washington will make you feel the cost. It was a threat designed to restore the old architecture through pressure. It produced the exact opposite effect, because every European capital that received that message processed it through the same filter. This is precisely why we needed the bank in the first place. Each act of punishment became in real time the strongest possible argument for the institution it was trying to punish. Think about what that dynamic looks like from the inside. Imagine a person who has always paid for everything at a shared house. They have used that financial dependency to maintain a certain authority over how the house is run. Then one day, the other residents quietly open a joint account, pool their resources, and stop needing the person to cover the bills. The person's response is to shut off the hot water. What that response reveals is not strength. It reveals that the only leverage available was always the threat of withdrawal. And once the other residents stop needing the house to run on someone else's money, the threat of withdrawal stops being frightening and starts being clarifying. That is the mechanism, not confrontation. Clarification. The pressure campaign did not weaken the alternative architecture. It validated it in real time in front of every government that was still deciding whether to take it seriously. There is an irony at the center of this story that history will find almost too neat to be credible. For years, Washington had been demanding that NATO allies invest more in their own defense. Stop freeloading. Take your own security seriously. Stop expecting American financing to carry the weight that sovereign governments should carry themselves. In a narrow technical sense, that demand was not entirely unreasonable. The alliance did need its members to be serious about their own capabilities, but there is a critical difference between independence that emerges from partnership and independence that emerges from necessity. What Washington wanted was obedient contributors, allies who spent more while remaining strategically dependent, still seeking American approval, still routing decisions through Washington, still treating the relationship as irreplaceable. What Washington got was genuinely autonomous actors, allies who had watched American foreign policy become hostage to domestic political theater for long enough that they stopped building their security assumptions around Washington's reliability. Allies who had asked themselves quietly, privately, in the language of contingency planning rather than confrontation, what do we need to build so that this never becomes our catastrophe? The bank was one answer. Canada was its structure, and the pressure campaign had not slowed the process. It had accelerated it. By late in the year, something was being discussed in Ottawa that would have been described as fantasy just a few years earlier. The possibility of Canada as a diplomatic bridge between European security architecture and Indo-Pacific democratic partnerships independently of Washington. Not in opposition to the United States, simply not requiring its permission. The bank's framework was already pointing in that direction. It involved Indo-Pacific partnerships alongside traditional NATO members, which meant the institution's host could potentially sit at the intersection of three of the world's most consequential strategic regions. A geopolitical role incomparably larger than the one Canada had occupied for most of the past century. And this is the word that mattered most in Washington when that possibility registered: optional. Not defeated, not replaced in any military sense. Optional, because the entire foundation of American alliance leadership for 7 decades rested on a single claim: that the United States was indispensable. That there was no Western security architecture that functioned without Washington at its center. The moment allies could build parallel systems, parallel financing, parallel defense innovation, parallel strategic coordination, that claim became negotiable. And empires, once they become negotiable, do not recover that status through threats. They recover it through reliability, through demonstrating over time that the thing they provide cannot be sourced elsewhere, through rebuilding the trust that converts power into partnership. Threats do not rebuild trust. They confirm why the alternative was necessary. What no tariff reverses, what no frozen defense board restores, what no diplomatic ultimatum recovers. Not confidence in American military capability. Nobody questioned that. What had eroded slowly over years of watching the alliance treated as a domestic political instrument was something different. Trust in consistency. The belief that what was built in partnership with Washington would still be honored across the next political transition. The belief that the relationship itself was not a bargaining chip. That erosion did not happen in a single catastrophic moment. It happened the way compound interest works, invisibly, incrementally, until one morning you look at the balance and realize the arithmetic has already made the decision for you. By the time the headquarters announcement landed, that arithmetic was already complete. The alternative already existed. It had a name. It had a city. It had capital. And it had the backing of governments that had made a quiet collective judgment that stability at this particular moment in history could be found somewhere other than Washington. Here is the number to hold on to. 0. That is the number of public ultimatums issued. 0 confrontations. 0 dramatic speeches. 0 moments of nationalist theater designed to provoke a reaction that could then be managed. 0 is how many times the man who built this raised his voice, because what he understood, and what the story of this entire episode demonstrates, is that the most dangerous thing you can do to a power that depends on being indispensable is not to challenge it. Challenging it gives it something to respond to, something to frame as aggression, something to rally its domestic audience against. The dangerous thing is to make it optional, to build quietly and precisely the structures that reduce the cost of its unpredictability, to give its allies somewhere else to stand. Once an empire becomes optional, the world does not wait for permission to move on. It does not announce the transition. It does not file a diplomatic notice. It simply begins in 100 small decisions made in 100 different capitals, building a future in which the old center is still present, still powerful, still relevant, but no longer the only answer to the question of who holds the West together. That future is not coming. It is already under construction. The question is not whether Washington understands that. The question is whether it still has time to decide what kind of power it wants to be inside it.